Welcome to Life Stories, where we dive into the heart of life's most powerful journeys. Today, we bring you a tale of family, betrayal, and self-discovery. Follow Claire, a woman who's lived in the shadow of her controlling sister, Hannah, for years, but when an unexpected inheritance changes everything, Claire finds the courage to take back her life. What follows is a story of empowerment, forgiveness, and the strength to rebuild after being torn apart. Join us as we explore this emotional journey. Let's begin today's story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more. The sound of my shoes echoed through the cold, empty conference room as I walked towards the long mahogany table. Each click of my heels felt like a countdown to something I already knew was coming. And with every step, the weight of my decision to turn up this morning seemed heavier. I could feel 20 pairs of eyes trained on me, each gaze filled with pity, judgment, and a certain cold detachment. It was suffocating. The papers in my hands trembled as I desperately tried to gather them into some semblance of order. But it felt as though the ground beneath me was slowly giving way. I knew, at that moment, that my career, my life as I had built it, was about to change forever. All because of one mistake. Hannah, this level of incompetence is unacceptable, came the voice I had feared. It cut through the silence like a knife. Her voice, so calm, so cold, carried with it a kind of power that had always unsettled me. My older sister, Hannah, never raised her voice, never needed to. Her presence alone was enough to make anyone fall in line. But this was different. This wasn't the controlled, quiet authority I was used to. No, this was something deeper, more vicious, like a well-crafted blade meant to leave scars. And it did. Claire, you've embarrassed not only yourself but our entire firm. Hannah continued, her words hanging in the air. There was no anger in her tone. But there was something far more chilling, disappointment. I could hear it, feel it, even as she stood there, her sharp eyes fixed on me, dissecting every fiber of my being. I had always known this day would come. I had worked under Hannah's shadow for years, fighting for recognition, fighting for respect. But no matter how hard I tried, I was never able to shake the feeling that I wasn't seen for who I was. That I was simply an extension of her. No matter what I achieved, it always seemed to be less than what she had already done. I opened my mouth, trying to speak, but my voice faltered. I can explain, I began. But Hannah raised her hand, silencing me in an instant. The Phillips case required basic due diligence, she said, almost as if reciting a fact I should have known. Instead, you missed a filing deadline that could have cost us everything. Her words sliced through me, each syllable sharper than the last. I had failed, not just my sister, but the entire firm. And yet, I could sense there was something more in her eyes. Something I hadn't expected, regret. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like she actually cared about my mistake. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard professionalism. Fortunately, Omar caught the mistake before it became irreversible. Omar stood near the door, his eyes soft with what might have been sympathy. It was hard to tell, especially in a room full of corporate sharks like Hannah, who managed to make everything feel like a transaction. She'd always had this uncanny ability to strip away any emotion from a situation, turning everything into cold facts and figures. It was a mistake. I wanted to scream, one mistake, but instead, all that escaped was a quiet whisper from Nicole beside me. This is wrong, she said. Everyone makes mistakes. The room grew still, every eye now focused on Hannah, who simply stared at Nicole, then at me, her expression unchanging. Hannah, you can't just, I began. But the words were cut off as she looked me in the eye. Her face impassive. Claire, clear out your desk. You're terminated effective immediately. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. And for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had been fired, publicly humiliated in front of everyone. 6 years of working under my sister's dominance, of trying to prove myself worthy of being a part of her world, ended in this one crushing moment. I felt the air leave my lungs as I stood, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor louder than I had ever heard. I could feel the tears threatening to spill. But I swallowed them down. Our parents would be ashamed of her. I thought. I had meant it as a quiet thought. But the words slipped out before I could stop them. Our parents would be ashamed of you. I blurted out, the pain and frustration of years of living in her shadow finally breaking through. Hannah's face hardened, and I thought for a moment she might lash out. But instead, something flickered in her eyes. Pain, maybe? It was gone as quickly as it had appeared. But I saw it. For the first time, I saw something other than the cold, calculating sister who had always stood above me. Our parents aren't here, she said coldly, and their absence doesn't excuse mediocrity. I grabbed my laptop and walked out of the room. My head held high, even as my chest felt heavy with a pain I couldn't quite name. Tears threatened to spill, but I refused to let them. I couldn't. Not in front of her. Not in front of them. Nicole caught up with me at my desk, helping me pack my things. This is wrong, she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. She's your sister. I laughed bitterly. Sister? Hannah stopped being my sister the day our parents died. She became my boss, my landlord, my keeper, everything except family. Nicole hesitated for a moment, then asked, "What will you do?" I didn't have an answer. I shoved photos into my box, including one of Hannah and me at my college graduation. We were smiling then, before everything changed, before she became the corporate queen and I became her obedient servant. As I walked out of the office, my phone buzzed. A text from Hannah. Rent due on the 1st. Don't be late. I looked at the towering office building before me, feeling the weight of the years I had spent working for her, living in her shadow, all the while unaware of the one thing that would change everything. Something inside me stirred, a tiny spark of rebellion. But what could I do? What was I supposed to do? At that moment, I didn't have the answer. But I would soon. I sat on a bench just outside the building, the cool spring air brushing against my face as I let the tears fall freely. For years, I had been trapped in my sister's shadow, working tirelessly to prove myself, only to be discarded so easily. But in the silence that followed my termination, something shifted inside me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was a quiet resolve. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, I was more than just the person my sister had shaped me into. My phone buzzed again, snapping me out of my thoughts. Another message from Hannah. Dinner meeting tonight, 7 p.m. We need to discuss your future options. I stared at the screen, the words feeling like an intrusion into the small pocket of peace I had just found. I ignored it, choosing instead to focus on the noise of the city around me. People streamed in and out of the towering office building, all busy with their own lives, their own struggles. I couldn't help but wonder how many of them had their own, Hannah's, in their lives. People who dictated every move, every breath. And yet, in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in years, a sense of freedom. For the first time, I wasn't under anyone's thumb. I wasn't a cog in someone else's machine. Just as I was about to stand up and leave, my phone buzzed again, this time with a number I didn't recognize. Hesitant, I answered. Ms. Morrison, a voice said on the other end. This is James Patterson from Riverside Legal Services. We're executing the will of your Aunt Riley O'Connor. Please contact us at your earliest convenience regarding your inheritance. Aunt Riley. The name barely registered in my mind. I had almost forgotten about her. She was our mother's eccentric sister who disappeared to Europe when I was young. We rarely heard from her. But inheritance? My heart skipped a beat. In the midst of everything, something had just shifted. Was this a sign? A way out? I stared at the phone for a moment before quickly calling back. The conversation was brief. Aunt Riley had passed away 3 years ago, around the same time our parents had died. I felt the air leave my lungs as I processed the information. She had left me something. Something of my own. My heart raced as the details unraveled. Aunt Riley's will was clear. The house on Maple Street, the house I had been paying rent for these past 3 years, was mine. She had purchased the Victorian 3-story home on Maple Street 20 years ago. And despite Hannah's relentless demands for rent, It wasn't part of our parents' estate. It wasn't even a property Hannah had any legal right to manage. It was mine, and I had no idea. I sat back down on the bench, stunned. The world around me seemed to slow as the weight of the news settled in. All those rent checks I had handed over to Hannah, my own sister, were not for a property she had any right to claim. My hands trembled as I tried to grasp the enormity of what this meant. For 3 years, she had been collecting money from me for a house I owned. As the truth hit me, I felt a mix of disbelief, rage, and a sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any of the corporate meetings or reprimands ever had. Why hadn't I known? Why had I been left in the dark all this time? I barely heard the sound of footsteps approaching until I looked up and saw Logan standing before me. Logan, my childhood friend. He looked concerned, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for some sign that I was okay. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with concern. I showed him the papers. His eyes widened as he read the details, his mouth falling open in disbelief. "Hannah's been charging you rent for a house you own?" he whispered. "That's fraud, Claire, actual criminal fraud." I could feel my pulse racing. This was the moment when everything changed. I wasn't just a victim of Hannah's control anymore. This was about something bigger. Something more important than our fractured family dynamics. I looked at Logan, my mind racing with the possibilities. For the first time, I wasn't afraid to act. The decisions I made from here on out would be mine, not Hannah's, and the first step was to stop letting her dictate every part of my life. My phone buzzed again, this time from Hannah. "Where are you? We need to discuss your situation." I stared at the message for a moment, then hit decline. This time, I wasn't going to answer. This time, I was taking control. I walked away from the building, my footsteps echoing on the pavement, each step feeling like a declaration of my independence. The weight of the past few days had left me feeling light, almost as if I were stepping into a new life. I didn't know exactly where I was headed, but for the first time in years, I wasn't following Hannah's path. I was walking my own. Logan had left me to my thoughts, giving me the space I needed to process everything. As I wandered aimlessly through the city, my mind kept returning to the house on Maple Street. My house. I couldn't believe it. I had been paying rent for years to Hannah, and all the while, she had been pretending the property was hers. The betrayal stung more deeply than I had anticipated. And yet, as I thought about it, I realized that the control she had over me was far more insidious than I had ever imagined. I didn't need to keep playing this game. It was time to stand up and claim what was rightfully mine. The phone buzzed again, and I glanced at the screen. Another text from Hannah. "Dinner tomorrow. Just us, please." I stared at it for a long moment, uncertain of how to respond. What was left to say between us? How could I ever look at her the same way again? I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I called the number from Riverside Legal Services and arranged a meeting. I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to take action. The following morning, I found myself sitting in a small, cluttered office across from James Patterson, the lawyer who had been handling Aunt Riley's will. The room smelled faintly of old books and paper, a stark contrast to the sleek, corporate environment I had just left behind. I ran my fingers over the worn edge of the wooden desk, listening as James explained the details of the inheritance. "The house on Maple Street was never part of your parents' estate," James explained, pulling out a thick envelope. "Your aunt purchased it 20 years ago and left explicit instructions that you were to inherit it upon her death. She wanted to make sure you had something of your own, something that couldn't be controlled by your sister." My breath caught in my throat. The house. My aunt had known. She had known all along that I needed something to call my own. Something that couldn't be taken away. "The property is free and clear," James continued, sliding the deed and keys across the desk. "The trust fund will cover maintenance and property taxes. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to keep the house." I took the papers in my hands, feeling the weight of them settle in my lap. This was mine. No more rent checks. No more Hannah's manipulation. I had a future now. One I could build without her. I left the office feeling lighter. But there was still a part of me that wasn't sure how to proceed. How could I confront her? How could I tell Hannah that everything she had been doing, everything she had taken from me, was about to unravel? But then, as I stepped out into the busy streets of the city, something shifted in me. I wasn't just angry anymore. I wasn't just a victim. I was ready to fight. For myself. For my future. I walked back to my apartment. The weight of the keys in my pocket a reminder that I was no longer at the mercy of my sister's whims. This was my time now. When I arrived home, I found Nicole waiting for me. She was holding a cup of coffee. Her face a mixture of concern and excitement. "Everything okay?" she asked. Her eyes scanning my face. "I'm done," I said simply. "I'm done with Hannah controlling every part of my life. I've got the house. I've got the inheritance. And I'm going to make sure she never controls me again." Nicole nodded slowly, a proud smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I knew you had it in you." I looked at the papers again. The deed to the house now in my hands. This was just the beginning. But as I looked out the window, the sun setting over the city, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. As I stood on the porch of the house on Maple Street, the wind gently rustling the leaves of the trees in the yard, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led me here. The house was more than just a property. It was a symbol of my freedom, of the strength I had found within myself after years of living under Hannah's control. It represented the lessons I had learned, not just about law and business, but about family, forgiveness, and the power of standing up for what's right. The journey had been long, filled with pain and betrayal, but it had also been filled with moments of clarity. I had learned that true power wasn't about control. It was about empathy, understanding, and the courage to be vulnerable. And it was in that vulnerability that I had found my true strength. As I stood there, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned to see Hannah walking toward me, her face softer than I had ever seen it. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of anger or resentment. Instead, I felt a sense of peace. We had both been through so much. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to heal together. "Are you ready to move forward?" I asked her, my voice steady. She nodded slowly, the tears in her eyes speaking volumes. "I think I am." We stood there in silence, the past finally giving way to something new. A new beginning, for both of us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories. Thank you for following along.